Imagine stepping into a room of power, a room you earned through hard work and the trust of the people, only to be treated like a stranger by someone who works for you. That's exactly what happened to the newly elected black governor of the state. In a shocking twist, his first day on the job takes a wild turn when his secretary, the very person who's supposed to manage his schedule, doesn't recognize him. What starts as a simple misunderstanding quickly spirals into something much bigger. As the secretary dismisses him, assuming he's an uninvited guest, the governor decides to play along, observing the situation with a mix of confusion and curiosity. But as the interaction unfolds, deeper questions emerge. Is this just an honest mistake, or is there something more going on beneath the surface? And how will the secretary react when the truth finally comes out? This story is more than just a moment of awkwardness. It's about assumptions, power dynamics, and how first impressions can lead to unexpected consequences. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about this encounter. You won't want to miss it. The governor stood there, a mix of amusement and disbelief playing across his face as the secretary insisted he leave. "I'm sorry, this is a private office. You can't just walk in here," she said, her tone firm but polite. He could tell she was trying to remain professional, but the slight edge in her voice betrayed her frustration. What she didn't know was that this man, dressed simply and without the usual fanfare of security or staff, was her new boss. He had chosen to walk into the building unannounced, wanting to experience the place through fresh eyes, unfiltered by the layers of protocol that usually surround someone in his position. It was a decision rooted in humility, but it was quickly turning into something far more revealing. As he stood there, he couldn't help but wonder, was this how things operated under the surface? Was this tension just a misunderstanding, or did it hint at a deeper issue in how people in positions of power, all those who looked like him, were perceived? He stayed quiet, curious to see how far this would go. The secretary, oblivious, began dialing security. His silence only made her more certain he didn't belong. As the secretary spoke into the phone, explaining that an unauthorized man had entered the office, the governor stayed rooted in place, his expression calm but his mind racing. He wanted to interrupt, to clear the misunderstanding, but something about the situation told him to wait. How often did things like this happen, he wondered. How often did people in positions of power get misjudged, overlooked, or dismissed? He decided to let the moment unfold. Meanwhile, the secretary was growing visibly uneasy. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye, sizing him up. In her mind, he was likely some overconfident visitor who thought he could waltz into the governor's office uninvited. She had seen a lot in her years here: pushy lobbyists, entitled donors, even journalists sneaking past security. But this man seemed different. Still, she wasn't taking any chances. Unbeknownst to her, one of the junior staffers passing by in the hallway had spotted the interaction. They hesitated for a moment, recognizing the man, but didn't speak up. Was it fear of getting involved or just uncertainty? The silence hung heavy as the seconds dragged on, the phone in the secretary's hand trembling slightly as she waited for security to answer. The governor stayed quiet, watching the scene unfold like an outsider in his own story. The secretary had hung up the phone, her jaw tight as she glanced at him again. "Security is on the way," she said firmly, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her voice now. He could see she wasn't entirely sure of her position anymore. The way he carried himself, the calm authority in his posture, was starting to make her second guess. In the hallway, the junior staffer lingered, torn between speaking up and staying out of what looked like a delicate situation. They knew who he was. Everyone had seen his photo after the historic election. But the scene unfolding felt so surreal. Would it be out of line to interrupt? What if they were wrong? The weight of those questions held them in place, frozen just out of view. Back in the office, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The governor tilted his head slightly, breaking the silence for the first time. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with something that made her shift uncomfortably. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the door swung open. Security had arrived. The room tensed as two uniformed security guards stepped in, their presence commanding but not aggressive. The secretary exhaled in relief, gesturing toward the governor. "This man doesn't belong here," she said firmly, her confidence returning now that backup had arrived. The guards exchanged a quick glance, their professionalism keeping their expressions neutral. But then one of them hesitated. His eyes lingered on the governor for a moment longer than expected, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Sir," he began cautiously, his tone uncertain. The governor didn't flinch, holding his gaze steady. "Yes," he said, his voice calm but pointed. "Sir." The second guard turned to his colleague, confused by the hesitation. The first guard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I think you should take another look," he said quietly to the secretary, nodding toward the governor. She frowned, irritation flickering across her face. "I don't need to look again," she snapped. "I know when someone isn't supposed to be here." The governor shifted slightly, his patience thinning but still intact. "Maybe," he said evenly, "you should listen to him." The words hung in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. The secretary faltered, her hand tightening on her desk. Something was shifting, and for the first time, she began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. The room fell silent as the first guard took a small step back, his posture subtly shifting in deference. The governor turned to the secretary, his expression unreadable. "I gave you the benefit of the doubt," he said calmly, though there was an edge to his voice now. "But let me make this simple for you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his official ID, holding it up for everyone to see. The seal of the state and his name, now unmistakable, gleamed in the light. The secretary's face drained of color as she stared at the ID, her breath catching. "Governor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The reality hit her like a tidal wave, and the confident facade she'd been wearing crumbled. "I didn't realize," she stammered, but the words caught in her throat. Before she could finish, the governor raised a hand, stopping her. "This isn't just about me," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "It's about what this moment represents. How many others are dismissed or judged before they even have a chance to prove themselves?" The second guard, who had remained silent until now, nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. The first guard straightened up, his face a mix of apology and admiration. But just as the tension seemed to break, the junior staffer from the hallway stepped into the room, clutching a folder. "Excuse me," they said nervously, glancing between the governor and the secretary. "I was going to say something earlier, but I didn't know if I should." The governor turned to them, his expression softening. "It's not easy to speak up," he said gently, "but doing the right thing never is." The final twist came as the staffer handed him the folder. Inside was a report about workplace culture and internal biases within the office, something the previous administration had ignored. The governor looked up, a knowing glint in his eyes. "Looks like I've got work to do," he said, his words carrying a double meaning. The secretary, still reeling, nodded silently, realizing this moment would be a turning point for all of them. The room settled into an uneasy quiet as the governor took a deep breath, closing the folder and placing it on the desk. "This isn't about assigning blame," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about recognizing the moments where we can do better, individually and as a team." His gaze swept the room, landing briefly on the secretary, then on the staffer and the guards. "We all have our roles to play in creating an environment where assumptions don't decide outcomes." The secretary nodded slowly, her earlier confidence replaced with humility. "I'm so sorry, Governor," she said softly. "I didn't mean any harm." He gave a small smile, not unkind, and replied, "I know, but it's what we do next that matters." As the tension eased, the junior staffer glanced at the governor and spoke up again. "If there's anything I can do to help with that report, I'd be happy to assist." The governor nodded appreciatively, recognizing their courage in stepping forward. By the end of the day, the misunderstanding had become a catalyst for change. The governor's quiet entry into his office wasn't just a lesson in humility. It was a reminder that leadership is about action, not title. And as he walked out of the room, everyone left behind carried the weight of that lesson with them, ready to make a difference.